You know that picture, right? That strange, skeletal machine hovering just a few feet off the sand, a man running alongside it. It's the moment humanity conquered the sky. But what if that one snapshot, that one famous day, isn't really the beginning of the story at all? Okay, let's get into it. Because the real journey to that moment is a century-long epic full of dreamers, scientists, and even tragic heroes.
We all love the idea of the Eureka moment, don't we? You know, that flash of genius in a lab, a single brilliant idea that changes everything. It's a great story, but honestly, it's rarely how invention actually works.
And yeah, this right here, this looks like the ultimate Eureka moment. The Wright brothers conquering the sky feels like this perfect, singular event. You see the photo, and you just think, wow, that's when it happened.
But was it really? Or was this moment less like a lightning strike and more like the final successful step at the top of a very, very long staircase that was built by a lot of other people? The real story is so much more complex, and frankly, a whole lot more interesting.
To really get what happened at Kitty Hawk, we need to rewind the clock. And I mean way back, more than 100 years before the Wright brothers were even born.
So in the early 1800s, the dream of flight was being pulled in two totally different directions. On one hand, you had showmen like Jacob Deegan, the so-called flying man, who wowed crowds by pretending to fly with these flapping wings, when in reality, he was secretly being lifted by a hidden hot air balloon. He was a fraud. But at the exact same time, you had Sir George Cayley, a quiet English scientist who was methodically, scientifically cracking the code of flight.
This guy, Cayley, was just so far ahead of his time it's incredible. As early as 1799, he figured out the fundamental forces of flight, lift, thrust, and drag, and engraved them on a small silver disc. He got it. He then built the world's first successful glider in 1804. I mean, think about that. 100 years before Kitty Hawk, Cayley had basically solved the problem of flight on paper, and had even proven it with models. The only thing he was missing was the tech to build a powerful enough engine.
So Cayley gave us the theory, the blueprint, but it took another brilliant and unbelievably brave person to take those theories and risk his life to prove them up in the air. And this brings us to Otto Lilienthal.
2,000. That's not a typo. That's how many times the German engineer Otto Lilienthal threw himself off a hill in a glider that he designed and built himself. He wasn't just some daredevil, though. He was a methodical experimenter. And he used the new technology of photography to capture his flights. These amazing images spread all over the world, proving to everyone that human flight wasn't just some fantasy anymore.
Lilienthal proved it could be done. He turned the dream into a real engineering problem. But, and this is a huge but, his method of control was a fatal flaw. He steered by just swinging his body back and forth to balance the craft. It was exhausting and, as it turned out, nowhere near responsive enough for the real challenges of the air.
Then, in August of 1896, the worst happened. While he was in midair, a sudden gust of wind stalled his glider. He fought to regain control, shifting his weight, but it was just too late. The glider plummeted to the earth. Lilienthal's death was an absolute tragedy, but it provided the single most important lesson for the future of flight: power is useless without control.
You know, Lilienthal's death didn't end the dream, it ignited it. News of his fatal crash reached a pair of bicycle mechanics in Dayton, Ohio. They were fascinated by his bravery, but were absolutely convinced his control system was the problem. And their names, of course, were Wilbur and Orville Wright.
And they weren't the only ones in the race. It was a true David and Goliath story. On one side, you had Samuel Langley, a famous scientist with a massive $50,000 government grant. His approach: build a really powerful engine and just strap it to a frame. On the other side, you have the Wrights, funding their passion project with profits from their little bike shop. Their approach, learned from Lilienthal's failure, was the exact opposite: master control first, and only then add an engine.
So what happened? Well, just 9 days, 9, before the Wrights' historic flight, Langley launched his hugely expensive aerodrome in front of the entire world's press, and it promptly flipped over and plunged right into the Potomac River. It was a spectacular, very public humiliation that proved that all the money and power in the world meant nothing if you couldn't actually steer the machine.
The Wrights' method was the polar opposite. They were patient, they were methodical, and they were obsessed with control. They did over 1,000 glider flights. They watched birds and invented wing warping, a system of cables that could twist the wings to balance the plane. And when they realized Lilienthal's data on aerodynamics was flawed, they didn't guess. They built their own wind tunnel to get it right. Only after they had solved the problem of control did they finally design and build their own lightweight engine.
Which brings us right back to those windy dunes at Kitty Hawk. That moment wasn't a beginning. It was a culmination. It was the final piece of a puzzle that was a century in the making.
You know, the first flight that day lasted only 12 seconds, but they kept at it. The fourth and final flight lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. It wasn't just a hop. This was sustained, controlled, powered flight. They had done it. They had cracked it.
And how did they announce this world-changing event? With this incredibly humble telegram to their father. You gotta love that Orville's name is misspelled and the flight time is off by 2 seconds. There was no big fanfare, just a simple message. Success. Inform press. Home Christmas.
Their father, Bishop Milton Wright, I think he captured the essence of their entire project with these words. This wasn't one man's breakthrough. It was a shared effort, built on years of collaboration, study, and tireless, hands-on work. It was their joint honor.
So that Eureka moment on the sands of Kitty Hawk, it wasn't a moment at all. It was an assembly. It was Cayley's century-old theory, plus Lilienthal's tragic but vital lesson, plus the Wrights' own genius for control, plus their methodical engineering, all coming together in one fragile machine of wood and fabric.
And that leaves us with a final thought. The story of flight reminds us that breakthroughs are almost never sudden. They're built on foundations laid by others, often over generations. It just makes you wonder, what great invention is taking its final form in some quiet workshop right now, about to change the world by standing on the shoulders of giants we've never even heard of?